Good evening. I'm David Gergen, and on behalf of the Kennedy School and our Center for Public Leadership, I want to welcome all of you enthusiastically to this forum, the first we've had this year, about social entrepreneurs. As many of you know, there is a spirit sweeping across this country and indeed across the world, especially among a younger generation, about a desire for change, indeed the necessity for change. And many of these younger people are coming out and starting new organizations that are very change-oriented to solve social problems, not just to serve in the same way to bridge gaps that have existed before, but to see if they can be change makers, to see if we can change the way we actually tackle so many of these persistent social problems that have been so unyielding over the years. And they are called in a new book that you'll be introduced to tonight, Unreasonable People. Unreasonable People. This is a chance to hear from some of the unreasonable people in our midst about this. I just would tell you that so many of us feel, as Robert Putnam wrote yesterday in the Boston Globe, that what we see in this country now is a degree of civic engagement, an expression of interest in civic engagement, which goes far beyond what we have seen in recent years. And one of the real challenges is how to capture it and to channel it. And that's a challenge here in this country, but we're seeing it all over the world. Nicholas Kristof has written about that, how many young leaders are coming forward now in other countries. But at the same time, to understand, there was a piece in the Washington Post today about a coming leadership crisis in the nonprofit sector. A coming leadership crisis in the nonprofit sector that so many are sort of dipping into it and then getting out. The pay is low. They're not quite sure where to go with their lives. And so the question, going to scale, how do you make this satisfying? There is a lot of desire out there. The question is, how do we build organizations? How do we change society in ways to capture all that intense interest? One measure, and we've had a lot of good people come out of the Kennedy School, and out of Harvard. Bill Drayton is a graduate of this university, who was a father in so many ways of the social entrepreneurship. Alan, Casey, Vanessa's husband, and Michael Brown started City Year after graduating here from the law school and the undergraduate school. Michelle Rhee, who's in DC right now, is a school superintendent, is a graduate of this school, Teach for America. But to get some sense of the rising interest, 6 years ago at Harvard, 23 students applied as seniors for Teach for America. The list just closed for this year, the graduating class, 340. 340. That's a measure of how much things are changing and the potential for change. Now, to moderate this, I'm very proud to step aside and turn it over. It's time the old generation got the hell out of the way, right? and turn it over to the younger generation, and literally, quite literally doing that tonight, turning the microphone over to our son. My wife Ann is here as well as we celebrate. He is a lifelong social entrepreneur, started some 6 organizations, teaches social entrepreneurship at Duke, runs an entrepreneurial leadership initiative there, has his own company at the same time, and is just publishing a book that's coming out with Josie Bass with the Warren Bennis imprint, called Life Entrepreneurs. I'm sure he will try to sell you a copy before the night is over. But with that, Christopher, it's your panel, your evening, and welcome and thank you to all of you on the panel.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. So we are collectively thrilled to be here, and it's so good to see. We had hoped that we were going to get this many people. It's nice to see really an overflow crowd all the way up, and it, I think, indicates the interest, as my dad has suggested. It's interesting, when I started back with social entrepreneurship and really thinking about the field a number of years ago, I realized that we were breaking through because one night I got a call from my mom saying that they had just returned from a dinner party, and at the dinner party they were playing one of those games of, if you could do it all over again, what would you do? And my dad was deep in the midst of politics at the time, and he said, I would be a social entrepreneur. And I thought, okay, we're making progress here. Shortly thereafter, I think I might have started to convince him to come to the left in terms of politics, too. So we have a terrific panel right now, and I'm going to quickly turn it over to them. I just want to introduce them, because I think we actually do have one of the most outstanding gatherings of social entrepreneurs and social entrepreneur thinkers in the field. And it was thrilling for me to be able to coordinate this in terms of my own travel schedule, to be able to share the stage and time with some really proven social entrepreneurs who've done some interesting things. So let me just start by a quick introduction, and then we're going to kick it off. We've got a challenge tonight because we have a limited amount of time and about 3 days worth of information to cover. So we're going to try and do it in breakneck speed, and I hope that you can all help me along that path. So just to my left, Stacy Childress is over at Harvard Business School. She teaches a course on education and entrepreneurship. And what we were just talking about is that that is now a two-class, it's gotten so much demand that that is now 2 different classes that she teaches back-to-back, which teaching one class, I think she's got massive marathon potential to do that. But the interesting thing is 160 people in 2 classes, 140 are actually at HBS, and 80 are committed to a longer-term career in education and entrepreneurship. So massively powerful. Stacy's also written 2 different case study books on education and entrepreneurship, one on looking at the high change districts that are doing some really interesting things, and now starting to look at education entrepreneurs that are doing some really interesting things. I definitely recommend it to you. Just to her left, we've got Leslie Crutchfield. Leslie is the recent co-author with another really dynamo woman named Heather McLeod Grant of Forces for Good. This is, again, something I would highly recommend to you who are interested in this field. Very powerful and really good lessons distilled from this, from a lot of good research that's been done, 4 years of research that was done putting into this. Some really good ways to both demythologize some of the things that are going on in social entrepreneurship right now, as well as call out some of the major lessons that are going on. Leslie is also a managing director over at Ashoka. You've all heard, I think, about Ashoka, and she's heading up something called the Global Academy, which is focused on trying to get more young people, especially in the college audience, inspired and interested in social entrepreneurship, really the next generation. Just to her left is Pamela Hartigan. Pamela is great. She's just written this terrific book called The Power of Unreasonable People. And all of these books, hopefully, they're plentiful around, and you can go order them. Have I mentioned Life Entrepreneurs yet? But Pamela was with the Schwab Foundation for a number of years, headed up all their social entrepreneurship work, and 3 weeks ago put in her letter of resignation to the Schwab Foundation to launch Volans Ventures. And we were talking about that just beforehand, and it's great talking about generation to generation, is that in part she did it because she came home with the Christmas vacation and she was doing 50-50, Schwab Foundation, Volans Ventures, and her son called her a coward for not actually going and jumping in 2 feet forward. So she's now fully engaged as a blended entrepreneur. She'll be talking about that tonight. Volans is actually, it's Pisces Volans, which means flying fish, which is a hybrid, a fish that can do very well in the air and very well in the water. And so she's going to be talking a little bit about that from the international perspective. And the nice thing about Forces for Good is it really looks at this from a domestic perspective. Some really interesting case studies. And Pamela does a really nice job calling this out from the international perspective. And just to her left is Vanessa Kirsch. Vanessa is, along with her husband, Alan, I think one of the real forebearers of the social entrepreneurship movement. Started her own 2 social entrepreneurship organizations, both of which have gone to national scale. Public Allies, which you're probably familiar with, as well as with the Women's Information Network, which has done some really important work. She's now, a few years ago, looked at how do we figure out more efficient ways to invest in nonprofit organizations across the country. Started a fantastic organization called New Profit, which is doing just that. Now, because she's a restless ADD entrepreneur like the rest of us, has also started something called America Forward, which we'll talk about tonight, which looks at how do we mobilize social entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders to get involved in public policy to really change the dial in terms of the policy conversation, and was directly responsible, I think, for helping Barack Obama actually start building this into his platform for national service and change, which is very exciting to see. We're also very lucky to have 2 social entrepreneurs, proven social entrepreneurs in the audience. We have Ilac Diaz. Ilac, from the Philippines, started an organization called Pier 1, which has had served over 200,000 people in the Philippines by providing them with interesting housing arrangements that will bring people in by cluster to make them more employable, to give them housing and employment opportunities in the maritime industry. He was named by JC's International as one of the top 10 outstanding people in the world, which is pretty impressive. And on March 11th, I've lost track of days, which is soon, will be a young global leader also with the Schwab Foundation. So really thrilled. And he's here at the Kennedy School of Government as a Reynolds Fellow, and he'll be able to share some of his experiences. We also have Rebecca Oney, who is a Harvard undergraduate alumni. When she was at Harvard, she ended up starting an organization called Project Health, which was geared around trying to get young people to get mobilized and get involved in public health, specifically working within healthcare systems in cities to try and change the way that those systems operated. After Harvard, she went off and went to Harvard Law School, clerked, went to go work for a civil rights law firm, and believed so much in the work that she was doing with Project Health and the opportunities that were there, now has come back to Project Health as their executive director. She's got 400 college students now working in 6 cities, affecting some 9,000 lives. And the interesting thing, just to go back to the statistics, is we now have 5% of her alum are now in Harvard Medical School and starting to really change the way that this conversation is starting to take place in terms of public health. So you can see we're sort of have a lightweight crew here. We don't have much to talk about, but we're going to try and do our best to try and get through this panel pretty quickly. So I'm going to turn it over to Stacy. So Stacy, in the context of defining social entrepreneurship, laying it out, and really helping this audience understand what it is, can you just sort of walk us through that?
Yeah. And by the way, I have that task, and I can do it in 3 minutes. That's the charge here, right?
Starting
now. So thanks, Chris. Since I'm on the faculty at the business school, won't surprise you that our definition of social entrepreneurship is actually grounded in kind of a long-standing definition of entrepreneurship. So if you're going to talk about social entrepreneurship and use the word entrepreneurship, you should ground that in some conceptual notion of what it is to be entrepreneurial, what entrepreneurs do. And the way we think about that is not about a particular kind of organization, whether startup or not, or a particular kind of person, but a set of behaviors. So entrepreneurship as a set of actions, a set of behaviors that one might take regardless of what sector they're in or what kind of organization they're in, right? So the definition that we use for entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity regardless of the resources you currently control. So the contrast is with an administrative point of view, which is the opposite. What resources do I currently control? And therefore, what can I accomplish, right? So entrepreneurship is seeing opportunity and pursuing it regardless of what resources you can currently control, with the faith and belief that with the power of idea, you can mobilize the resources you need. And by that, we mean people, money, support, time, et cetera, right? Social entrepreneurship, the definition that I use and propose, is just an adaptation of that versus a fresh start, right? So it's the pursuit of opportunity. This is where it gets different. The pursuit of an opportunity to create pattern-breaking social change, regardless of the resources you currently control. So what do we mean by pattern-breaking? Well, basically, we have lots of organizations that have existed for a long time in the social sector that do very good work, that do work that's critical to a healthy society. Many of them focus on actually reducing the effects of a problem. And that's very important. What social entrepreneurs strive to do is actually change the problem itself, right? Create an environment in which the problem just doesn't exist anymore. So it's a different kind of point of view. The way I think about it is, rather than creating workarounds to an existing problem, what social entrepreneurs try to do is change the way the world works. They don't want the world to work that way anymore, so that the problem just doesn't exist. So a bit of a different orientation there. And so how do social entrepreneurs go about doing that? So some key characteristics, and then I'll stop and you'll see some examples and other people get to respond to that. And later you can call me out on that if you think that doesn't work definitionally. So here's some key activities, characteristics. So social entrepreneurs typically see a problem that people have seen for a very long time, and they have a new insight about the root causes of the problem, right? And they develop a theory of change, we call it, which is simply a notion of cause and effect. Which actions might we take that would address the root cause specifically so that the problem begins to go away, right? So a theory of change is just about cause and effect. And then they create organizations. I mean, these are folks, generally, that create organizations and try to affect change through the vehicle of an organization, addressing root causes through the vehicle of an organization. So they have a strategy to do that, create an organization. Very concerned about outcomes, right, and adapting their strategy for change based on what they see in outcomes. Those are characteristics that identify social entrepreneurs. But there's a bigger piece of that, right, because that's kind of a micro activity. It's an organizational level view, and social entrepreneurs have that, and they're very, very dedicated and committed to making their organizations the best they can be. But social entrepreneurs in general, the ones that we mostly know about and that are really creating important solutions, also participate in a macro way. So they start an organization, but they also either start or join, kind of affiliate with, a larger movement that is about this notion of actually changing the rules of the game so that the world works in a different way than it did before we all started, and they have the insight, understanding, and kind of ego boundaries to understand that they can't actually do it all themselves with their organization. But if you're really going to change the way the world works, there are a bunch of levers. You need other organizations, not only entrepreneurs, but established organizations to operate differently than they currently do. You need policy changes, legislative changes, those kinds of things, right? So entrepreneurs work both at the macro level and try to get it really right there, but they also either start or join larger movements committed to the same notion. So I know we have some examples of those kinds of things, but those are kind of the highlights. What's different about social entrepreneurship from regular entrepreneurship, what's different maybe about social entrepreneurship than more direct service, long-standing social purpose organizations.
And there are, if you go to Leslie's books, you can actually pick up on some of the additional definitions. Greg Dees is another terrific resource for those who are interested in this field, who's down at Duke. To ground this now, I want to bring it over to Rebecca. So Rebecca, can you walk us through, picking up on sort of Stacy's idea here about social change on the macro level, and I'm particularly interested in the fact that it's not just 400 volunteers rolling up their sleeves and putting in candy striper hours at the hospitals, but actually trying to work towards systemic change.
Yeah, the candy striper thing always kills me, I have to say. So, I mean, to build on what Stacey was saying, from my perspective, the power of social entrepreneurship has always been about systems change. And from my perspective, it's changing systems in two ways. One is adding new elements to those systems, unprecedented elements to those systems that really in some ways disrupt the normal flow of operations, but also being very strategic about the assets that those existing systems have and really leveraging those assets more strategically, more thoughtfully, more powerfully in some ways than they have previously. And there's, from my perspective, the power of social entrepreneurship is really around providing simple, cost-effective, almost elegant solutions to otherwise seemingly intractable challenges, complex challenges. And my work, of course, is in healthcare, and I can think of no more complex, challenging system than the healthcare system in this country at this point in time. It's, across the aisle is understood as complex, costly, not aligned behind preventative care. And from the beginning, Project Health's vision has really always been about a different kind of healthcare delivery. And really was, in fact, born of conversations that I had as an undergraduate with physicians down in the pediatrics department at Boston Medical Center, in which they shared with me, they said sort of time and time again, day in and day out, we have families come to the clinic and the child has an ear infection or the child has an asthma exacerbation. And they say, I provide antibiotics or I provide an inhaler, but the real issue is that there's no food at home, or that the family's living in a car. And from my perspective as a pediatrician, they would say, if we are truly to improve health outcomes among the most vulnerable kids and families in this city, Boston, we need to go way beyond that. And so Project Health's model has been about, again, in some ways, a very simple solution of having college students sit at a desk physically located in the clinic waiting room, our family help desks, and use the clinic as a gateway to connect families out to food, housing, childcare, job training, really whatever resources they need to be healthy. And although a sort of fundamental part of the model is at the end of the day about the families, about the 13,000 kids and adults who we each year connect out to those resources, really the vision has always been larger than that. And our theory of change really speaks to a healthcare system in which families' non-clinical needs, their socioeconomic and psychosocial needs, are routinely and systematically addressed as a standard part of patient care. And Project Health's vision is to play a catalytic role in really transforming the healthcare system so that it does address those needs every time a patient comes in the door. We are at Project Health are lucky to be a new profit portfolio organization, and New Profit has imposed great discipline on us in really trying to understand with great detail what systemic change looks like and how Project Health's direct work on the ground can play a role in creating that change. And I think every day we come closer to really understanding how to have that kind of leverage, how to really build a different kind of healthcare. And just to provide a brief example, most recently we have implemented new systems in clinics down in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins and at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., where now every time a patient comes into the pediatric clinic, when the nurse takes that child back to do blood pressure and height and weight, the family is also provided with a very basic 5-question psychosocial needs screen asking about food, housing, childcare, job training, and education, and that form is then handed to the physician and literally generates a prescription written by the physician for those resources, and that prescription can then be filled at our family help desk. And from my perspective, the power of this is really beginning to envision and in fact see in practice a healthcare system where food is recognized as important to ultimate health outcomes as height and weight and blood pressure. So I know that Leslie will speak more about leverage, but I think from the beginning our understanding has been about sort of using that clinic as a gateway and really providing an opportunity to leverage the existing clinic systems in order to transform the way care is provided on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's great. And we'll come back to hearing a little bit more about Project Health during our Q&A session. So to pick up on that, one of the big gripes about social entrepreneurs is, flash in the pan, sexy, not scalable. But some organizations are starting to get there. So, talk us through that leverage model. How have some nonprofits really been able to break through, and especially in relationship to government, corporations, figuring out broader relationships, the network kind of work that you talk about in Forces for Good?
Sure. Well, thanks, Chris. I'm glad to know that social entrepreneurs are sexy. I think this is a major advancement.
On this panel, I feel like,
now this
I'm the odd man out over here.
This not scalable thing, I
Literally.
think, is the challenge. Sexy and scaling. That's your moniker.
Some social entrepreneurs.
Living it.
So in Forces for Good, we actually write about 12 of the highest impact nonprofit organizations to be founded in recent U.S. history. And they really range from the very scaled and the very sexy, like Habitat for Humanity International, which operates in more than 2,000 sites around the world and has an annual rolled up budget of $1 billion worldwide. So that's pretty scaled. To the less well-known organizations like Self-Help, a credit union that started in North Carolina that's really revolutionized the predatory lending industry through legislation action. And then some kind of unusual suspects in our book as well. The Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. What unites all of these groups is that they do the things that social entrepreneurs do to achieve wide-scale systemic change. Back to Stacy's point around definition. This is what drives social entrepreneurs. It's the wide-scale change, and I think the differentiating piece is around this leverage, how they find points of leverage to create far more impact than they could just through an organization alone. Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, has a great quote. It goes something like this: social entrepreneurs are not content to just give a man a fish or even teach a man to fish. The social entrepreneur will not rest until she's revolutionized the entire fishing industry. And that is a difference between the social entrepreneur and a nonprofit leader. And it's this concept of leverage and how do you change an entire system. To explain this concept of leverage, it's kind of high-minded jargon, but if you think back to the ancient Greek philosopher Archimedes, he has a quote that's commonly paraphrased, "Give me a lever and a place to stand, and I alone can move the world." Today, we all experience leverage in many different ways, right? In physics, the concept of leverage has to do with physical force. For those of you who are students, the last time you unpacked your boxes and moved into the dorm across the street here at Harvard where I went undergrad, you probably used the dolly. You've used leverage to pick up many more boxes weighing far more than you could if you had to do it by hand. In business, the concept of leverage also has a very particular application. Wearing my MBA hat as a graduate of the business school across the river, in venture capital, the whole concept of leverage is what the industry is predicated on, right? You make a small investment in a very small company, and if it becomes the next Google or the next Microsoft, you get exponential return on that very small investment. Well, for us in the social sector, leverage also has a very important meaning, and it allows us, those of us who seek wide-scale social change, to achieve more change than we could just through our organizations. And that's why social entrepreneurs don't just focus on the four walls of their institution. They build movements, and they look for points of leverage in policy, in the business world, among mass citizenships. At Ashoka, we call it citizen bases of support, and even in their networks of other nonprofits. Because we in the for-profit sector, the best actually work in collaboration with other nonprofits, not seeing them as potential competitors for scarce resources, but allies in our cause. So to give you an example, I'll use the example of City Year, one of the 12 great nonprofits in our book. Because we're here in Boston, I'm just curious, how many here are familiar with City Year? If you are, raise your hand. Great, so a good many of you. For the few who aren't, City Year was founded 1989. It's a deliberately diverse youth corps that engages young people in service to the community. When City Year was first founded, it was a single site here in Boston, now almost 20 years ago, and it had 60 corps members. Now the organization itself has scaled to have 18 sites around the country and one in Johannesburg. So City Year has graduated a little more than 8,000 corps members, and those corps members have impacted hundreds of students' lives through the community service that they do in the course of their City Year. But what's more powerful about City Year is that from the beginning, they weren't just building City Year, they were building the national service movement. Today, through AmeriCorps and the national service legislation that was passed back in 1993 under the Clinton administration, 70,000 young people can serve their community, not just through City Year corps, but as Teach for America corps members, as Jumpstart volunteers, through Habitat for Humanity, through Youth Build USA, another of the groups in our book. What did this take? It took the social entrepreneurs, the founders of City Year, Alan Casey and Michael Brown, focusing not just on their organization, but flying down to Washington, D.C. every week for many days at a time, putting their political capital, their social capital, their time, their money into moving that legislation. And for those of us, of you in the Kennedy School, it might not come as a surprise for people to be engaged in policy reform. But for the vast majority of the nonprofit sector, this is not comfortable. Politics is seen as kind of dirty, unseemly. I just want to get food to the hungry on the ground. I don't want to get mixed up in that stuff. But social entrepreneurs get involved with politics, get involved with business, because they're driven to achieve as much impact as they can. And policy is a key lever to have that systemic level change. So the challenge for us here today, I think, is to think about how can we engage more people in thinking how to leverage policy. And how can the policy world look to social entrepreneurs, not just as a place to outsource the functions of government, but as a source of ideas for true innovation. And that's what Vanessa's going to talk about later.
And we are going to talk about that. And I actually want to start cueing your thinking on this as we get to the Q&A section, because there's, I think, a very rich conversation for us all to have about how does the interplay between politics, policy, corporate, and the social sector all operate, and where do you fit in there? How do social entrepreneurs fit in there? So I think that's a very rich conversation for us to have. So Pamela, I want to turn it over to you now. In your book, I think one of the beauties of your book is that we often in the U.S. have a very domestic orientation to what's going on. And we very rarely, you hear a ton about Teach for America, but how often do you hear about Pier 1 and other organizations that are doing some really interesting things? So the Power of Unreasonable People, I think, does a beautiful job actually casting the net around the globe and pulling out some international examples of exactly what Leslie's been talking about in terms of the leverage model, people who are doing some really interesting things in terms of this blended role. And I love the fact, Stacey, that you start with entrepreneurship, right, that then is applied to the social sector. So as we look at the blended model, especially from the international lens, walk us through that a little bit.
Well, at first I'm delighted to be here, and it's wonderful to be back at Harvard with all of you people. The international perspective is an interesting one. One of the things that, and to build a little bit on what Stacey was saying in terms of the definition of entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, you get 100 people, entrepreneurs, in a room from many different parts of the world, and it is surprising to see that their characteristics are all extremely similar. They're very much driven by the same things, even if they're working in different fields. But there is one tendency abroad which is different than in the US. So far, Leslie has been talking about the not-for-profit world. The thing that's very interesting in other countries that don't have the philanthropic history as the United States does is that when entrepreneurs with a social mission, with a drive to change the world, go about to set up their enterprises, they have to set them up as businesses, as social businesses, as for-profits, because the kind of money that is available to the social entrepreneurs in this country from philanthropic resources isn't as readily available in those countries. But there's a positive side to that, which is that by setting them up as for-profit businesses, even though they don't have shareholders and they don't distribute profits, they are actually able to scale and access funds from the capital markets in a way that is much more readily accessible than social entrepreneurs that constitute themselves as not-for-profits. And they do the same activities in terms of leverage with governments. I'm going to talk very specifically about one of the entrepreneurs that I refer to in the book. Now, Leslie asked you how many of you have heard or heard of City Year. I'm going to ask you, how many of you have heard of Christopher Columbus? Okay, probably everybody. But you probably have not heard of Cristobal Colón. And that is the name of this entrepreneur, Spanish entrepreneur. How his parents ever called him Christopher Columbus is beyond me. But this man's name was not only...
As a fellow Christopher, I think they went right with the right approach.
Yeah, but the last name. And Cristobal became a psychiatrist. He worked in mental institutions with psychiatric patients for the first 10 years of his profession. And he became very frustrated by what he was seeing as the kind of therapy that people, that the medical or the psychiatric community engaged with them, which was very similar to what you do with people that have intellectual disabilities, which is you give them something to do, something to make, keep them entertained, but what they make is something that no market is going to be interested in, no consumer will be interested in buying. And it's, to a certain point, demeaning for the very patient. And so what Christopher did was decide these people are not dumb, they're crazy. They need to have a job that makes them feel that they're contributing to something, just the way any one of us wants. So what he decided to do was to set up a business that would employ the mentally ill. And he set up, for some reason, a dairy farm, probably because he lived in Catalonia, which is an agricultural area of Spain. And he tells the story of going to get his bank loan to set up this dairy farm. And he talks about walking in to the bank to say, my name is Christopher Columbus, I'm a psychiatrist, and I want to set up a business that's going to employ crazy people. You can imagine how the poor loan officer thought. I've always told Muhammad Yunus he had nothing on the challenges that Christopher Columbus
At least he
did.
wasn't named Don Quixote.
Exactly. Well, pretty much. Chasing windmills. The point is, today, La Fajeda has the third market share in dairy products in Spain. It is a profitable business. The profits are not shared among shareholders. They are actually reinvested in building and developing the social mission of the venture. Christopher likes to say that he basically set up the business upside down. He first had the workers and then decided, how do I build a business around that? And he is working very closely with the Public Health Ministry because he is revamping in the very same way that advocacy and thinking of systems change around the world. He is advocating for a completely different way of treating mentally ill individuals. And this is having a substantial, profound change in Spain on the treatment of these individuals. So many times what we tend to do is to sort of dichotomize where we make our money and where we do good. The really exciting thing about entrepreneurship is that it's blending both of these things. I remember in the very early days when I first started looking into this, I remember defining social entrepreneurs as what you get when you marry Richard Branson and Mother Teresa. Well, it really is very much that way.
That would be an interesting match.
Rather horrifying, I think, actually, when you think about it. But some are more prone to the Richard Branson type, setting up the social business, but very much mission-driven. And others are, of course, in the not-for-profit sector, but it's going to be very contextual. And I think the reason why it's so exciting to see the evolution of this space is because we really will bring the power of business thinking to affect social change and to actually create a different kind of capital market, a capital market that probably has a much, more a heart and a soul, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. As we're talking about this conversation and you all are looking at other resources to tap into, Pamela's work at the Schwab Foundation, the Skoll Foundation's work now, and the work that they're doing in Oxford is a really interesting resource. And another organization that I would certainly recommend that you check out is Endeavor, run by a woman named Linda Rottenberg in New York, who invests in really interesting blended model entrepreneurs around the world. Endeavor.org, you can check it out. So to bring it all home, I want to introduce Elok. And we talked a little bit about Elok's work with Pier 1. And I want you to tap into the idea that you have a few supporters out there that believe wholeheartedly in you. JC's International being one of them, who I know are here tonight. But you've been able to leverage that, speaking of leverage, to now serving 200,000 people in the Philippines. So if you could walk us through how you got to that stage, that would be great.
Well, the way that I started actually was, I have to admit, for-profit. I was an MBA student. And we had this course on serendipity walk, which is you walk through an area and you're supposed to be able to figure out these businesses because you had so many case studies. So the way the professor would do it is open up a map and then just drop a pen on it. And with mine, I think he went a little bit to the right and dropped it in the middle of the largest shanty town in the country. I think there were about 3 million people over there. And so I was there scratching my head. I said, sir, I was trained for-profit. I don't know how I'm going to make a great business plan to pass my exams with this one. And he said, look, never turn away from something that bothers you. If you have something that bothers you and you come up with a product, you can come up with an ongoing business, and if this is something that people need. If you can come up with a solution that helps people, you can change the world. And that was it. I went to the deep area, and in fact, over there, people don't even, the police don't use like common handguns. They actually have a bigger rifle over there because it's just so dangerous. And lo and behold, where he dropped his pen was a street where Habitat for Humanity was actually. And so I started working with them, and the thing that I did was use my business skill, which was put a usage attitude image, which is find out who was there, why do they use the place. And I found out that most of the people there were migrants from the rural area coming to the urban area to look for jobs. And what happened was there was this disconnect between building single houses. And I said, sir, what people want to do is get out of here. They don't want to live here. The only people that are living here is because they get stuck. There's no way for them to find a job. The city's expensive, and when they run out of money, they want to live there. And so what I did was, my first donation to Habitat was actually money, not for a house, but I said, since most of the people here are single people looking for a job, they need a place to stay. So every Habitat house, I would build an extension. And that extension was financed. Why? Because before, whereby they could just use the house, now people could rent the house beside it. So the women would pay me back the extension of the house, and the single individuals that wanted to look for a place to stay could now rent it, and the woman would actually cook for them and make the start of money. Then I started saying, you know, something's wrong with the whole system, which is if they're poor, give them a house. I know this sounds logical for the longest time, but what if we address why they're here, which is they want to look for a job? So I talked to employers, why don't you want to hire these people? It's because they were saying, we don't know where to find them. I want a carpenter, goes into a shanty area. Do they start asking, are you a carpenter? Are you a carpenter? So there was this disconnect from the people with skills and the people that could employ them. So what I started doing was I said, okay, let me try my own business, which is, okay, I started financing this extension to these houses. They paid me back, plus they paid me interest. Now, why not group them not by income, but by profession? So what I did was found out that one of the largest groups there were seafarers. And so what I did was group whole batches of seafarers, just 40 of them in an area, but called up every agency that hires seafarers. You know what? Within a week, all of them had jobs. Why? Because people could now find out, like a physical classified ads, where do we find these employable people? Now, I want you to just take a minute and say, I'm not talking about seafarers, but maybe I can do with construction workers. I can do with sales lady. If people know how to connect job to people with the skill level of that job, then you have a way for people to earn enough to get out of the shanty system. And think about it. People in the shanty systems are the farthest from any kind of basic services. Far from schools, far from water. Why would they want to stay there? In fact, a lot of them are just wondering how to get out of there. And that 40 beds happen to have also another problem. Most people in the shanty areas, when they run out of money, they do this part-time parking, you know, they do this low-income job of cleaning, filing. So what I did was find out what Habitat was doing. Well, it's not wrong. I'm just saying that there was some ways for some text. So they started doing like bracelets and, you know, ashtrays. But then I found out that nobody really buys these things. Why are you teaching people to do some kind of skills or crafts that actually had no market value? Or people wanted to buy it, they buy it once or twice in their lifetime. So what I did was started putting up bottled water stations. I said, okay, come to me if you're a seafarer. And if you don't have a job, why don't you work for your stay? Why is that important? Because when this bottled water, I went to every agency that was drinking and, you know, consuming this bottled water, and they became my best clients. They said, well, you're taking care of my seafarers, I'll buy your product instead of any other product with the bottled water. So that made them be able to work for their stay. You have no money, work for your stay. $1 a night. It grew from 40, 60, 100, 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000 beds. The problem with, I think, the nonprofit for the longest time is it asked young people, give me your labor or give me your time to gather funds for this particular problem. But some of the greatest business jumps ahead has been new waves in skills. Why do you never ask us, maybe there's a new way to do it, a more sustainable way to do it, a greater way to make an impact on the world? And so this one enabled me to actually look at the problem wherein now there was these people being employed, and there's people that would come into the dormitory with a skill level, and very soon from 12 months to get their first job, went down to 3 months, and now with the computer technology wherein we list everybody that keeps on coming back to the dorm, will be immediately on the web. Hopefully they'll be employed even before they come back from their seafaring tour. So is it possible to change the world? Yes, but you have to know what is the engine. A charity engine, we would burn our money very quickly. But with a self-sustaining system, we can help 200,000 people or more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilak. Yeah. So, Vanessa, first of all, you got to follow that.
I know.
But we've got confidence. for you to be our cleanup. So walk us through how we really scale this. We've talked a lot about this idea of, systemic change, changing the rules of the game, et cetera.
Yep.
You've seen this now as a social entrepreneur and scaling both of your organizations. You've seen this now as an investor, and now you're playing in the public policy sandbox.
Yep.
So walk us through America Forward and where you're going with it.
Okay, I do want to do that, and it's just great to be here with this audience, and I see many social entrepreneurs in the room, so I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of experts in the audience as well.
It's intimidating.
It is
actually.
intimidating.
Looking out there, and they're like, you don't know what you're talking
Yeah.
about.
And I think that where I'm going to go is focusing on the public policy aspect of it, and I do want to highlight before I go there Pamela's point that there's a phenomenon in the United States that I think is really unique right now, more to the United States and a great opportunity on the policy front. But there are two ways to scale. One is to change the way capital flows and to think about new sectors and for-profit and nonprofit, or there's to really turn to government. And so I just want to say, I'm going to focus on the government point because I think we have a real opportunity. And so I'll tell you, it wasn't as if I was sitting around saying, gee, could I start another thing? I don't have enough to do right now. But it was more that about 2 years ago, we convened our portfolio of social entrepreneurs with a set of other social entrepreneurs in the country. And we had a closed-door conversation in which we said, how do you guys feel about your progress? How are you doing? And we brought this wonderful guy who happens to be your father, David Gergen, who challenged us and said, you all are doing incredible things and you're scaling rapidly, but all the scale, if you ever achieved your wildest dreams, you will never really make a dent in history. The challenges are just too big, and you're missing the point if you forget, and I'm totally paraphrasing, but I hope you don't mind, if you don't get into politics, because you've got to look at the resources the government has, and you can't act in a way separate from that. And he was supposed to be the inspirational speaker. And we all sort of looked and thought and were really challenged by that. And it actually spoke to us a lot because any of us, say if we're working in education, as great as Teach for America or New Leaders for New Schools or any of these great entrepreneurial organizations are, the amount of money the government spends on education is so much more significant than anything we will ever touch in philanthropy, even with Bill Gates and all the players that we now have. And so the question really became, how do we get out of what we are calling sort of the social entrepreneur trap? And I can tell you as a venture philanthropist who is investing in organizations and telling them to stay more focused and triple and quadruple and grow their growth and more rapidly and better execution, I have investors who are on us to develop these organizations so that they scale more efficiently and more effectively. And that's wonderful, and we have consulting firms and all this to help them. But what happens is when you get focused and when you start, Teach for America in the last 3 months hired 380 staff, not teachers, but 380 staff. And when you start living your life trying to just figure out how you're going to pay their salaries and all, you don't want to spend any time going to Washington, talking to government, et cetera, and you just get into your trap. And every day, you get more and more focused on how to grow your organization, and you don't have time to look up and see how you can work with other organizations or how you can influence the system you're actually up against. And so as social entrepreneurs, we all came together and said, we have to do something about this. And the moment is now because we have an incredible opportunity with an open election. So 2 years ago, looking at what was going to come and knowing that we hadn't had this open election in 50 years in America, and it was a chance to have real ideas at the table, we came together, all of us, and we agreed to sort of sign on the bottom line to be in this together. To get social entrepreneurs to flock together is not an easy thing. It's like getting eagles to flock. They don't really flock. But to get them to say, I am going to devote a portion of my staff, a portion of our resources to the collective purpose of trying to change the way government uses its money. And so 2 years ago, we launched what we collectively, 60 organizations joined in, social entrepreneurial organizations, to launch America Forward. And we had been incredibly impressed by what Bono has done with the Millennium Fund. So we brought in Bono's experts, and we hired them because we also agreed that we couldn't do this full-time ourselves. And we put together a coalition of experts to really help push America in a new way. And I want to talk a little bit about what that new way is. As we think of, I grew up in a generation where we thought, the government is not the solution, and young people weren't going into government. And we were actually talking, everybody was saying the era of big government's over. But we haven't really defined, well, what is the next era? And we think it's the era of big citizenship. We think it's an opportunity for citizens to be more engaged in problem solving in America. But in order for that to happen, we have to change the way we work with government. And so our America Forward imagines a day when, just like in the private sector, we have a system that takes great innovation to scale. And we have seed capital and venture capital and mezzanine capital, and we take things public, and we have a whole system of small business administration and government that supports these entrepreneurs. We have a whole system that government supports to support for-profit entrepreneurs and innovation scaling. We don't have that same system in the social sector, and we believe that government can play a role in doing that. And so our vision is that government will start to say, what is the best idea out there, and how do I find what works, seed what works, find what works, and support it to scale? And that is not the way currently. And I'll take an example. We were working with the mayor of Atlanta, Mayor Shirley Franklin, a wonderful woman, totally committed to college access. But her thought was, I've got to start a college access program in my city. I'm going to develop myself. I'm government, and I'm going to create a college access program. She didn't go out and say, what's the best social enterprise in America, and how do I bring it to my city? That's the kind of work that we want to see. That's how life, if America Forward succeeds. To be very concrete, and we did get very involved, we spoke to all the campaigns, 14 or 18. We met with every single one. We are working totally nonpartisanly. And we're really excited about the final 3 candidates, or 4 candidates, depending on how you count, but that are there because, as all of you know, the Clintons have been supporters of social entrepreneurs and national service. Barack Obama has given a significant speech on his commitment to these ideas of America Forward, to the ideas of a social investment fund, to the ideas of scaling national service as an engine to fuel the talent. The McCain team, he's been a huge advocate forever on national service and is really understanding social entrepreneurship. We're just seeing across the boards, we're at a very exciting time for social entrepreneurship and its relationship to government, because the first time ever, all the candidates are talking about it. And we just did a national poll. We commissioned Peter Hart to do a national poll so we could continue to help inform the candidates on how, as they move forward, they can really think about their administrations and social entrepreneurship. And we're seeing huge movement. The 4 ideas that we're really pushing, one is that we have a White House Office of Social Innovation, Social Entrepreneurship, just as we have a faith-based office now. That office would focus on the things that work, be a bully pulpit that would drive these ideas, not only from the White House, but on through each cabinet position. We imagine a network of social investment funds similar to the venture philanthropy world that would find the things that work, but would be led by local community folks to help scale what works to communities. A lot of these enterprises are all in major cities. They're not in the local communities. They're not in rural communities because nobody can afford to bring these social enterprises there. These network of funds would bring those social innovations to those communities. We're pushing for a small business administration for the nonprofit sector that gives the technical assistance and support that the business administration gives to the for-profit sector. And lastly, we feel it's critical that we scale national service. Currently, national service, 75,000 young people do service every year. That's really the engine of resources that we get in our organizations to scale. We want to see that Barack is committed to 250,000 annually, and we're looking to try to get it up to 1 million. So those are the kinds of things. And this is a movement, I just want to say in closing, that we want all of you guys to be a part of, because we all vote. We have an opportunity to hold these candidates accountable. We have an opportunity to work in our local communities, to encourage our mayors and governors to get involved and pay attention to what's going on in the grassroots in these communities as a key part of solving social problems.
Terrific. Okay, so now I'm going to invite people up to the microphones. There are 2 microphones down here. I think there are 2 microphones up there. Here's the key thing with your questions. Make them questions. Make them short questions, because then we can get through more of them, and make sure that every question ends with a question mark. Okay, So I see one up there.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. I find it fascinating because I, too, am a social entrepreneur. I run a small nonprofit based here in Harvard Square. My question has to do with barriers to entry. We've talked a lot about the really successful organizations, but it seems to me, especially for young folks just out of college, there is a very large barriers to entry to becoming social entrepreneurs. I had a number of very lucky and fortunate breaks to be able to build my organization and make it successful, but many folks have not had those same sort of chances or benefits of the different resources or helping hands. I went to Williams College, and I can count on one hand my friends and recent graduates that are social entrepreneurs right now of the recent class years, and that's thousands of graduates from Williams in recent years. So clearly there's, I think, a lack of initiative, or there's a lack of resources, it seems to me, for especially young social entrepreneurs that lack the track record. I know, knocking on dozens of foundation doors, I was turned away from many of them because there simply weren't the resources available.
Pull into a question.
Yeah. So what can we do to help encourage young social entrepreneurs to sort of take the step and that leap towards starting their organizations and providing the resources? How do we find those resources, and how do we encourage that?
Sounds good. Thank you for your question. So I want to actually, Vanessa, you want to answer that? But I want to, Stacy, I think you got maybe a good perspective too in terms of the education sector. So maybe Vanessa, then Stacy.
Okay, I get to challenge universities like this one in a way that maybe she might not be able to. So I want to start by saying one of the things, we need to support financially young people going into this work. It is an incredible risk. I've started 3 nonprofits. Every time I start it, I go with at least a year of no salary or half a year of no salary. And that's ridiculous. And it's got to be a priority of universities like this one to support it. And I happen to be an alumna of Tufts University, and we've just this year said loan forgiveness to anybody who goes into the nonprofit sector. And I think that is just the kind of thing that we as a community need to push for, et cetera. We're also in our America Forward initiative really pushing for government funds because part of AmeriCorps could be a social entrepreneur stipend. It won't be, a huge amount because government can't do anything, but it's, support student loans, just as if you go do a year of City Year or 2 years of City Year, you get student loan payoff. Encourage young people to start things. I agree with you, there's just not enough resources, but between government and universities, this should not be a problem in America, and I think we need to get to the historically black colleges, we need to get to the Latino college. I mean, we need to really get out into the networks and communities that are where the people who are in the communities know the problems and don't have access to these resources.
And just APS does some stuff too in terms of really stimulating this.
A couple of things. I mean, Vanessa's exactly right. I mean, we're sitting in one of the graduate schools of basically the richest nonprofit institution in the world. And to have a conversation with my students who want to go start something and are struggling with whether or not financially they can just support themselves for the year or so it takes to get it going, it's almost a ludicrous conversation, right? So part of it is, whether it's at Williams or here or other institutions around the country, is just, if we have a priority on helping people actually go live out their dreams, understanding that those are going to take a variety of different forms and the same kind of energy and resources that we put toward more traditional career paths. So at the business school, we spend an enormous amount of resources and time and money and people getting people into investment banking jobs, right? It's kind of interesting that we spend as much time as we do on that. And so one of the things we've been advocating for a number of years is, if you think about social enterprise as another large part of the US and global economy, we ought to be spending at least as much time in terms of strategy for recruiting organizations to think about our students, money to support folks. We've got a loan forgiveness program and those kinds of things. So I think that's actually something I'm not afraid to challenge. I mean, David and I were talking earlier about, why is it that across a few graduate schools here, we have a handful of people in each thinking about social entrepreneurship separately, right? Just because that's the way the university works. So if we're talking about change the way the world works, maybe we could start with changing the way Harvard works. The handful of us, and not think about separate social enterprise faculties, but is there a way to take, because we're not in conflict with each other ideologically, in fact, it's a nice challenge to push each other on the different ways we think about this stuff, and none of the graduate schools on their own can field enough people in terms of faculty time and resources to do this really well on their own. So is there a different way to think about the model? So in doing that, is there a way to inspire our students in ways that we're currently not quite haven't quite figured out, to consider this as a viable way to spend their time right after graduation? So part of it is the resources question, but the other is you can do this. Like, you don't have to wait 5, 10, 15 years to do it. So if we can make it financially feasible for people, which seems to me it would take a commitment, but it's the easier commitment, right? How do we actually talk to young people like you and like your colleagues in ways that help them understand this is actually a very credible, legitimate way to invest yourself, surely when you're 57, but also when you're 27, right? So if you think about your NPV, for all you business school students out there, think about the net present value of your career over your lifetime. The earlier you start, the higher the value, right, and the lower the discount rate. So, sorry.
You're getting geeky on us.
Yeah,
I'm going to cut you off on the geekiness.
That's right. But I do think we have a responsibility that we're not, that we haven't fully embraced and realized yet. We need to do that.
One other thing I think we all need to take into consideration is that the nonprofit sector as a whole is facing a massive human capital deficit. And so I would encourage all of us, as we're talking about this, that you should not be thinking about how do I start a social enterprise for social enterprise sake, but actually how can I get involved in the social enterprise movement and be supportive in an entrepreneurial way and help catalyze more nonprofits, rather than going out and creating. There are 600 youth nonprofit organizations in Boston alone, which is ridiculous. So how can you figure out a way that we can get away from the fragmentation and towards the movement?
Yeah, 115 nonprofits start a day.
Right, exactly.
So we don't need that many more of that.
We do not need more nonprofits. What we need is more effective nonprofits. Okay, so let's go ahead over here.
Great. Hi, my name is Tori Hogan, and I'm at the Graduate School of Education, also a Reynolds Fellow in Social Entrepreneurship, and possibly being an emerging unreasonable person. What advice do you have for all of the young innovators here in the audience who are either dreaming one day of starting their own or not, or are currently in the venture startup phase like myself, and it's a pretty scary place to be? What do you either wish you knew, or from your experiences dealing with social entrepreneurs, what's the best bits of advice you can give us?
Leslie, you want to take that?
Well, as you're asking that question, I was thinking about one of my first mentors in social entrepreneurship. Before I launched my first venture, actually after taking a year off from college, my first social venture, I had the opportunity to work in Philadelphia, where I grew up, with an amazing social entrepreneur there by the name of Marcine Mandelman. And she was guided by the 3 M's, which were money, media, and the mayor. If any of those things call, you drop what you're doing. And the idea is, first you have to access the resources, to the original student's question. And I don't think it has to do with your educational background. I mean, the groups in our book, some of them were Ivy League grads, but the most weren't. Raul Azaguirre, the executive director of National Council of La Raza for 30 years, who grew it into its high impact today, is not a product of this Ivy League institution, for instance. I would say, in terms of the media, look early on to get visibility for what you're doing, not just for self-promotion, but because by raising the visibility, that brings you partners, it brings you more resources, and it also enables you to work in concert with those around you. And then in her case, it was the mayor. She grew a program for adult literacy in Philadelphia and relied very much on government, both support, to create that larger change. So that's my first advice. Remember the 3 M's. Compliments of Marcine Mandelman.
How about over here?
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a mid-career here at the Kennedy School. And everything you said sounds very much like work that social movements and grassroots organizers have been doing for hundreds of years, whether in the labor movement or in anti-apartheid movement, worker centers. So how, if at all, is social entrepreneurship new and different?
Pamela, you want to?
Well, I think this is probably geared more to a domestic audience, I think, because for me it's extremely different looking at it internationally. So
take it internationally and we can lob it back domestically.
I think to the point that was made earlier in terms of a palliative approach to solving a social ill, traditional nonprofits have been much more geared towards that. I think there's a bit of an activist in every social entrepreneur. There has to be. The difference for me is really a business savvy that is more advanced perhaps than the traditional grassroots movement that certainly internationally that we've seen before. If I look at Amnesty International or Greenpeace or any of these groups, there's more advocacy involved than business focus or a market principle focus.
Vanessa, I know you're jumping out of the chair, ready to go.
Well, no, I think it's a great question, but I think the difference, what we as social entrepreneurs talk about is action taking. We believe in creating a demonstration of something that works, and then using that demonstration to do the things that Leslie was talking and Pamela was talking about in terms of leverage. So when we look at a lot of the 60s movement, and I was a big, actively involved in the PIRGs and a lot of the community organizing, because I grew up here in Cambridge, but it was more around the advocacy and building the movement part and not necessarily based in a product or an idea that had been proven and tested and shown results that was trying to replicate. And so what a lot of the social entrepreneurs, and to the detriment of the social entrepreneur movement, we have been so focused on building these action tanks that we haven't gotten to the movement part. And that's where we could have missed the ball, but I think are starting to get more active in not only building that action tank, but making sure we're actually action tanking, which is using that leverage to influence policy. So we have a lot to learn. I want to say, I think our movement stands on the shoulders of the advocacy and social change movement, and what we're bringing to it is a new dimension, which is, okay, we're actually going to build these institutions because somebody has to do that these days, because government used to be able to do all that. Now in America, at least, government can't do it. So we have to build the institutions and then try to use those as advocacy tools to change policy.
Can I make one suggestion? There's an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, I think SSIR, from a little less than a year ago.
Which is a great resource,
yeah,
by the way, for people
article
to check out.
is called "The Case for Social Entrepreneurship Case for Definition," and they
Right,
actually
yeah.
make an attempt to make the distinctions you were just asking about. So they have the obligatory 2x2, where here's what social activists are, here's what direct service organizations, social service organizations are, here's where social entrepreneurs are, and what the distinctive differences are. I think, some of it I would argue with a little bit, but I think they do a pretty nice job of trying to say what the distinctions are. So you might go look for that.
That article
yeah.
is actually by Sally Osberg.
That's right.
Is one of the authors.
From Roger Martin.
Yeah, and Roger Martin from the Skoll Foundation.
Yeah.
So
Should
do
look
you
that
want to, did you want to make any additional comments to that, Eli?
From a development point of view, social enterprise, it's not like we can get philanthropy. In fact, most of the philanthropy of the money comes from government or government-to-government decisions. So a lot of it is not social. It's a matter of survival. And you were talking about how do we spread social enterprise. Well, the way that we did it was come up with business plan competitions, which is instead of giving people solutions, sometimes the very people in that community have been working on that solution for a long time, except it just does not come out, and you cannot get mentors and capital to them because we don't even know they exist, especially from a rural point of view. So we feel this Philippine Emerging Startup Movement, and we found some of the most innovative people to bring capital to. In fact, just recently somebody invented in a remote area, how to transport fish without water or ice. He just lowers the temperature and puts salt in the water, and that's another thing, and the fish goes to sleep. Multi-million peso, or I would say, he got such a big capital investment because he could move fish and a large amount of it, and it's sleeping. So sometimes, sometimes the greatest innovations are out there, except that we want to give solutions to them. But the greatest revolution now, as I said, is maybe they have the solutions and we just have to match. So whenever the winner comes in, we match them with mentors and match them with capital. So we're able to give money from a central capital system to the remote provinces where they need it most. And you know that 70% of the population of the poor is in the provinces. So we've got to get them excited, and at the same time, we have to multiply ourselves. That's the only way for young people to make an impact. We cannot focus on one area, but we can inspire others. So there's two ways. One is to start up your own social enterprise, and for those who bring something here tonight, is to inspire other people to become social entrepreneurs. Because we need an army of young people to make a change.
Ilak, while you have the floor, can you also just make a quick announcement about your competition that you have coming up so that people who are ready to dive into the fray, into the arena, know how to do that?
So one of the Dean's main call is called Acting in Time, which is how do we make policies and strategies that when climate change affects our vulnerable areas, we can prepare for it. But then what we were saying is, 3 billion of the people of the world, which are the poorest, only have 2% of the carbon emissions, and yet are affected 85%, sustain 85% of the damage. So we made a survey and found out the place that these people run to are schools. When everything else are damaged, they all run to schools, except that they were built so cheaply and have such a short shelf life. So what we did during our time here is create the Millennium Schools competition, whereby we are trying to find out how to build schools better and safer. So we threw a competition and we got 100 inquiries and 50 architects who are saying, look, the problem here is not just to come up with theories of what the world will be like in 20 years. The problem is what are the people suffering now and how can we extend our help. So why does this need to be done? Because architecture of cement, steel, and glass, which used to be the only way to build things, is no longer available for the poor people. They keep on having to wait for charity to come in. So we have to build new industries that were never before thought of, new blueprint on how to survive this kind of climate change. Although climate change might be an annoyance, and once again, we have to come up with a new blueprint on how to save our people, if not displace them from areas that are now in critical condition in our hotspots. So on the 6th of May, we will be displaying some of the top ideas on how to build better schools and safety nets for these people. And it's just an idea of how new industries can come out of that based on these new ideas of young people. So we really have ideas, but we need a voice. And that's the nice thing about social enterprise, which is not asking us just to donate our money and time, but maybe, with a great idea or a sustainable business, we can impact net a lot of people rather than just shoveling and collecting money. We can do more.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Joseph Porcelli, and I'm the director of a nonprofit in JP called Neighbors for Neighbors. The most unreasonable thing I've done is wear a name tag every day for 2 years now, and got 19,000 other people to do it. And this year, my neighbor Dan and I started something called the Mug Project. And my question is, in addition to being able to do some outreach, so for example, Finagle Bagel is now a partner, and you'll see it on Channel 5 tonight, and at 11, and
Media.
tomorrow at
The mayor
5
will
and
call.
9. What resources are available to us to sort of help us further our mission? I'm, not here at the Harvard School. I have a full-time job during the day, and so does Dan. But what resources are available to us? The impact of our project in, 2005, 14.4 billion paper cups were thrown out, and I think 24 billion styrofoam cups. So if everybody in this room, just ask yourself, do you drink coffee or tea or water, and are you using a mug or a reusable container? The impact is enormous. So how do we further our mission?
So the question is, how do you further the mission of your particular organization, or how
Not in this particular organization, but people who aren't working or in an institution or have funding to do that. We just, one Sunday, decided this would be a fun idea.
Yep, Leslie?
So one of the fortunate things we have in this country is, as Pamela said, we do have a deep history of philanthropy, and we also have, obviously, wealth, which for Ashoka is very different because most of the countries where we operate, there's very limited wealth to go around, and that's obviously the billions of people in poverty that he was mentioning before. So there's a number of programs that social entrepreneurs, people that are trying to start new nonprofits, whether you're a student or not, are out there. So Ashoka is one. We have a global fellowship. We support more than 2,000 social entrepreneurs around the world since 1980. ASHOKA.org, www. Get your neighbor to write it down. Echoing Green also is no longer just recruiting on college campuses, but also provides fellowships. The Draper Richards Foundation, a foundation that I advise here in the Boston area, the Goldhirsch Foundation, is now starting to fund social entrepreneurs at the mezzanine stage. Vanessa Kirsch's New Profit Inc. funds mezzanine stage, the Skoll Foundation. So based in this country, there is a sort of a panoply of organizations that are designed to support social entrepreneurs. For those of you that really are trying to go to scale and go to wide scale systemic social change. The other thing I would just say back to the earlier questioner's point about, is this new or what's different? I mean, speaking from the perspective of Ashoka, this is not new. I mean, movements is how we've made change in the world, since the beginning of time. Ashoka is actually an Indian word. It has two meanings. The first, it was named after the 4th century BC ruler, Ashoka, who didn't have such a great life in the first half of his life, but the second half integrated the Indian subcontinent, brought Buddhism, and really built the first public systems, the first schools, the first hospitals. So he was a social entrepreneur. We talk about Florence Nightingale being a social entrepreneur, having the insight, working with soldiers coming back from the war, that if you did something really simple like keep their wounds clean and do very basic hygiene, you could save lives, and created systems around that. So there's been social entrepreneurs over time. What's new and different today is just the political climate and the funding that's available, whether you're in a developing country context or here. And I think if you have the vision and if you have the drive and the persistence, you will succeed. The resources are out there for you to find them.
So we have time for 2 more questions, and I'm sorry that we got to wrap this up just because we've got so much more to talk about. But oh yeah, okay, that's a good idea. Breakthrough innovation there. Vanessa. Forget about this one question at a time.
Yeah, I can't stand
You can ask it. Why doesn't everyone stand up with one question?
Yeah.
And then, okay, so why don't we just, everybody who's currently standing up, fire your question out. We're just going to take all the questions and see if we can weave them together in terms of one broad breakthrough answer.
Okay. My name is Jimmy Tran. I'm a joint degree student between the business and Kennedy schools. We've heard about leverage and we've heard about scale, but we haven't really heard much about the private sector. And so my question is, how do we leverage and use scale to and effectively engage the private sector to help social entrepreneurs create change? Specifically, I'm interested in 2 different things I've heard recently. One, the idea that even multi-billion-dollar companies such as Google can embody certain elements of social entrepreneurship. And 2, the use of social alliances, such as that between City Year and Timberland, for example, in order to create change.
Okay, terrific.
My name is Rasmus Bertelsen. I'm a research fellow here at the Kennedy School, and I work on American and French missionary higher education in the Middle East, and I'm starting to wonder whether I'm working on social entrepreneurs. So I'm just curious whether you would count missionary educators as social entrepreneurs.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be curious how we're going to weave all this together.
Right. It's a great challenge.
I all of a sudden see more people standing at the microphone. You guys are really going to throw us a curveball here.
Nice.
Okay.
Good evening. Ty Sunanan, master's candidate here at the Kennedy School and entering doctoral candidate as well. My question is, one of the greatest challenges, I think, in the social entrepreneurship field is to measure impact. So you can speak to sort of how the Schwab Foundation or New Profit measures the impact and the outcomes of these institutions, organizations, and people. Is it as simple as saying, they've gone to scale? Is it as simple as saying they've replicated? Is it as simple as saying they've affected policy changes in their respective areas?
Good, great question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Larry Goldberg, and I work in a media and technology-oriented social enterprise known as public broadcasting. But I've been asked by 2 local colleges, one a business school and one a tech school, to help develop a social enterprise incubator to help with some of these questions about resources. And I guess my question is, you think that's a good idea? And what might we do to get started?
Excellent. Let's keep on this microphone.
Hi, Jeffrey Bilzikian. I've recently made a transition from a major employer to a major funder. And I found that my experience as an employer has been much more enriching and helping people's lives and really helping and nurturing and getting people through a life cycle. What about teaching people to be a great employer?
Okay, last one.
Hi, I'm Marcy Murninghan, and I am currently an Inspire Fellow at Tufts University's Institute of Global Leadership. 14 years ago, I was teaching at Harvard Divinity School and collaborating with Greg Deese when he was there,
Oh, great.
and I'm a big fan of what he's been able to achieve. 25 years ago, I got my doctorate from here from a man named Paul Ilvesacker, who probably single-handedly turned the Ford Foundation into from a backwater foundation into one committed to social reform. I learned from Greg that there's a continuum on which different leadership challenges exist. The continuum runs from purely social enterprise to purely profit-making enterprise, and the challenge is to look at the convergence of those things. From Paul, I learned that one of the important and noble traditions in organized philanthropy has been the tradition of reform, not just palliative philanthropy. My question is, and it's back to this issue of things are not, it's not a new concept, it's just a different time. What are the provisions that you folks have made and all the great work you've done for taking the lessons of the last 50 years, the demonstration projects of model cities, the Gray Areas program that Paul created at the Ford Foundation, which served as a prototype, a demonstration project, if you will, for the war on poverty. Those demo projects were cut short by a few assassinations and a war. What about the demonstration projects of the 70s and the 80s? Someone mentioned the South Africa divestiture movement. It was not just a movement. There were a number of actions and new ways of doing business that were taking place, both regarding socially responsible investing as well as corporate social responsibility. In the 90s and currently, we're seeing far more innovation. So are you looking at the lessons of the past to inform the evolution of social entrepreneurship? And if so, how?
Okay, good. Okay, now Vanessa, your big idea here. How are we going to weave all this together? I mean, we've got a bunch of really interesting questions. Did you all write them down? I wrote them down.
Yes.
I'll toss them out as we want to see fit. Who wants to
Maybe
take what?
closing comments? Should we just...
Yeah, let's have some closing comments that address these kinds of questions. That's a wonderful idea. Vanessa, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'll pick selectively from these, but I did want to speak, I cannot emphasize enough how much what we're doing, movements just take on different shapes based on the time and the moment in history. And I think the movements that are going to be most successful are the ones that have learned from the past. The way we concretely are learning from the past, we're actually in a process of studying the efforts of these successful cities, the urban city projects you mentioned. We're actually in a partnership with the Kennedy School of Government in a 3-year study of that in which we're bringing together, looking at the past and then talking with mayors about the future. I was one of the leaders of the divestment movement when I was at Tufts, and I think there's huge amounts to be learned. I think that the key that's going to get us to the next phase is that we work together and we knit these together. The change that we need to create today is so much greater than ever in history, I believe, and I don't think this ever will work unless we bridge the civil rights movement, we bridge the advocacy movements, we bridge a lot of the efforts that have gone on before, and we use the power of the private sector. And I did want to say that I think a lot of these movements have in the past not utilized the power of the private sector in a way that social entrepreneurs bring that part of they bring another ingredient to the table. And our boards are filled with corporate leaders, major CEOs. This movement is fueled and has a key link to the corporate sector in a way that I think hasn't in the past. And that completes the circle in my mind, because it's really about bringing the 3 sectors together. It's about bringing the nonprofit sector, the private sector, and government together to solve problems, because we can't do it alone. And that, to me, is what's sort of truly unique. And the reason I think we're able to bring the private sector to the table is because of how we measure results. And I think that the people in academic universities like this one have taken us so far, and we can actually speak to measurement and results in a way that we've never been able to before. We can actually talk about the change and actually measure it. At New Profit, every one of our organizations uses the balanced scorecard. That was a tool invented for the private sector, for them to measure their performance. Robert Kaplan, who invented it at Harvard Business School with David Norton, has worked with us to adapt it to the nonprofit sector. But the private sector, then, they see something they're familiar with, and it's easy for them to get engaged in an organization that shows results. So I think that the reason we've brought the private sector in is partially because of our utilization of those private sector tools. And that's probably all I can cover right now.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Rebecca, why don't you go next?
I would just touch on a couple of points that was made, both about sort of the social enterprise incubator and also some of the resources and leveraging the private sector. I guess I sort of look out on the field of social entrepreneurship and actually sort of see a spotty field, which is that there's some areas like education, for example, and job training where there's been a high level of activity in social entrepreneurship and social enterprise, but others, and obviously speaking from my own perspective, in healthcare, for example, particularly in the domestic context, where there really haven't been the same kind of innovations and real investment from the social entrepreneurship space. And so I guess I would say that if thinking about creating a social enterprise incubator to really to build on some of the lessons that already exist in the social entrepreneurship field and to really try to think about how we can map new efforts against areas, particularly, as I was saying before, intractable social challenges where the methodology and impact of social entrepreneurship has not been brought to bear in the same way. And I would just say, likewise, on the private sector piece, I think we often go to the place of thinking of corporations when we think about private sector dollars. Project Health's work from the outset, we've been embedded in the healthcare institutions that we're working to change. They both provide the overhead and particularly over the past few years have agreed as part of the arrangement to actually subsidize the cost of our programs. And so I think another strategy is to actually look at the very sectors that we're seeking to change. And as Vanessa was saying, there's a lot of dollars in education. There's a lot of dollars in healthcare. And part of our work is, I think, about really helping the leadership of those sectors think how to reallocate those dollars more strategically.
Great. Excellent, excellent point. Pamela?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that strikes me as we've been talking is really how inward-looking within the U.S. People seem to be focused. And when you're looking at lessons learned, please look at lessons learned elsewhere. There are phenomenal examples of private sector collaboration. In fact, that's really where most social entrepreneurs in other countries that are not in the U.S. are looking. And corporations are more and more fascinated with the field of social entrepreneurship. Why? One, they will say, you know, we have no problem attracting talent. We have a heck of a time retaining and developing them, because actually they're having a problem connecting what they do in business with a meaning to their lives. And it would be very important to have some way of incentivizing by giving them an opportunity to work with social entrepreneurs. The other aspect is that social entrepreneurs are working at the market fringe, responding to market failure, where major companies cannot go in because the risks are too great and the profits are too low. And so what they're finding is that these social entrepreneurs are actually collecting market intelligence around how should they be shaping their models to actually be able to give goods and services to that particular population in a way that takes into account the specific needs of the population. And finally, of course, the whole issue of their reputation and their image is greatly enhanced. And they're finding that there's a huge connection between their bottom line and the way they're going to be, interacting with groups of populations that have been previously excluded. So this is a huge issue. And just a final note, I find that, yes, in the United States there is an enormous amount of interest in education and activity and social entrepreneurs, but that has to do with the fact that as opposed to in other countries where maybe, say, in Colombia, there's a huge issue around, violence and joblessness. In France, it's all about inclusion and immigration, et cetera. So you will find that countries develop socially entrepreneurial responses in response to the pain that that particular setting has. So when you're looking at opportunities for learning, how do I start my venture, look beyond the U.S., please. Thank you.
As Pamela was talking, it reminded me that the Sanskrit translation of Ashoka is the active absence of sorrow, which is what social entrepreneurs and activists are acting for, are pioneering for. In my summary comments, I wanted to tie together some thoughts to the gentleman's comment who's moved from being an employer, and I'm assuming that's in the for-profit sector, to a funder, and to your question about how do you change business practices. When we write about in Forces for Good, there's actually the third chapter in the book is called Make Markets Work. And it's how social entrepreneurs, not just in our book, but over time, have always tried to influence and create more change by working with and through the private sector And in fact, to use an international example, Mohammed Yunus, who's a member of Ashoka's Global Academy, the founder of the Grameen Bank, obviously a Nobel laureate from 2 years ago, when he had this original insight that the poor are bankable, that you can extend credit to those who do not on paper look credit worthy, and not only be repaid, but be sustainable in that. I mean, he sparked now a worldwide microcredit movement that's brought billions in to help people bootstrap themselves out of poverty. He didn't start that by creating his own bank. He went around Bangladesh, where he's from, starting in the Chittagong province, where he was teaching at the time when he made his first individual loan, and said, I need to convince the banks to change. Because if I don't change the way the system works, in this case, the commercial banking system, state-chartered banks, I can't create that ripple effect of change. That's how social entrepreneurs think differently. So to your question, how do you change the way business fundamentally operates? It's not just about partnering. City is great at partnering with Timberland or Comcast in Philadelphia. Beyond that, how do you get into the way a business does its business so that they liberalize their lending practices and include the poor in their clientele? Pamela writes a lot about this in the examples of her book. And I think the challenge for this time in this country is because we're operating on the shoulders of the civil rights movement. I mean, the civil rights movement was about being excluded, right? And over the century, we saw the ascension of capitalism. Business was seen as the root of all, capitalism is the root of all evil. I mean, we in the social sector are trying to address the negative externalities that business create in a lot of times. But I think where the pragmatic part of social entrepreneurs come in is we're not going to put business out of business. So how do we work from within and get business to change? And maybe, Google's founding mantra when they went public was do no evil. If they can't be a force for good, at least how can they become less of a force for evil?
Stacy?
Yeah, so I won't repeat. It's all terrific stuff. So just kind of back to this notion of if what we're really trying to do is change the way the world works so that the problems don't exist anymore, or at least we have new problems to solve instead of continuing to bang our heads against the same old problems. To the questioner that said, are you learning anything from the past, and what about the generational stuff is kind of what I hear you saying a little bit. I mean, I had this conversation today with a student of mine based on a conversation I had with other people yesterday, is specifically about education entrepreneurship in the US. Generally, folks that care about it kind of line up behind one of two camps. One is we care about competitiveness, global competitiveness, right? And you get business people really excited about that argument. If we can change the way education works in the US, we can be more globally competitive. There's a whole other set of people that get really fired up about the social justice side of that argument, that it actually shouldn't be determined by the zip code you're born in the richest country in the world, what your access to opportunity is. It's like just fundamentally not who we say we are, and yet the facts on the ground would say that's exactly who we are, right, if you actually look at how it works. And so to really change the way the world works, we have to find a way to put together those two sides, right? The group that gets really fired up about the competitiveness issue, but in some ways is very skeptical of the way the social justice argument looks and sounds. And we got to get the folks behind the social justice argument to actually be less skeptical about the way the competitiveness argument looks and sounds. And so that's generational, right? So there's a prior generation whose idealism was expressed through activism. The current generation, the activism or the idealism is being expressed more through organizations. And so that can sound very different from each other, but there's a lot of common ground there. So I think and I can give some other examples, but those are two specific ones. I think the task for those of us who really think about this, care about it, or engaged in and involved in it, is to think about kind of dichotomies like that exist, that have developed somehow naturally, and be very deliberate about saying, those are actually false choices. We don't have to choose between whether this is a competitiveness or a social justice argument, or whether or not the activists that came before us really accomplished everything, and since they didn't, now we're going to do it this way. I think that's, it's okay that the movement hasn't been there yet, because we've been trying to figure out where we are and what this is. But I think we're now to a point that what got us to the place we are after 15 or 20 years of this new movement, so to speak, probably isn't the point of view that's going to get us to the next level over the next decade, right? And so thinking very deliberately about what are the coalitions that have to be built across groups that actually care about that have different motivations for wanting to solve the problems and can be kind of naturally skeptical of each other. If we just leave it to its own devices, the false choices will continue to seem like real choices, and they're just not. And so I don't have the specific answer for how we do that thing, but I do think it's the task, right? So that the 60s generation doesn't feel denigrated by the message of the social entrepreneurs, right? So the folks that care about competitiveness and business kinds of issues don't feel that the moralizing tone of the social justice movement isn't calling them immoral or unethical or lesser or racist or whatever it is. And like figuring out actually how to talk about this in ways that bring all the different pieces, because the problems are too hard to solve if we can't figure out how to do that. So,
fantastic. Yep, there you go. So we had the incubator question. I saw a friend of mine, Andrew Walk, who just walked in the door earlier, who has something called the Root Cause Institute. Check that out to get the incubator answer and get in touch with them. As far as the missionary work, read these two books, look at the definitions, and figure out actually if that lines up, because it probably will. In closing, I want to promote these two great books, The Power of Unreasonable People and Forces for Good, and did I mention Life Entrepreneurs? And also, we've got the two case study books, obviously, coming out from Stacy. I do want to thank all of you. It's fabulous that we actually have 3 rows of people here tonight. It shows the power of this movement. I really do think, picking up on where Stacy's going, we do have a responsibility to think about what the next generation of this thinking looks like. America Forward points in that direction. I think that the work now that everybody on this dais is talking about is working towards that. So we thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank our panelists. Rebecca, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.